hard, I think, when you come into a church new like this to realize that it really has a history. And we don't have anything around the building that really denotes that. I know when I go back to Cambridge, in the First Congregational Church there, for instance, they have portraits of all their ministers from about 1650 on the cover. And you realize, boy, that's been there a long time. So our history is more in things that we've done, the history that we've made by being a very active, involved, social, action-oriented congregation. But in 1891, which is when it was founded by a missionary group who came out from downtown Plymouth Church, and this was then the town of Brooklyn. And Brooklyn needed a church, and so they started this little church down on 41st and Northeast 41st in Brooklyn. So that was in 1891. In 1910, there was a new church built at 43rd in Brooklyn, and that was dedicated, as I say, in 1910. And Dr. Kane, who was the president of the University of Washington at that time, was one of the groundbreakers for the building of that church. So our people history is very interesting, and I just made some notes on some of the folks who, over the years, with names that you probably will recognize, were very involved in this church during their lifetime. Dr. Edmund Meany, Bertha Matthews, do you know that name, any of you? She was the mayor of Seattle, and I think maybe the first woman mayor of any city in the United States, certainly in Seattle. And she was very involved in this church. Frederick Padelford, you know the Padelford Hall over in the University campus, and he was a member. Edward Magnuson, well-known name around here. Henry Benson, there's a Benson Way or Benson Road, I think. I remember him and his family very well. Boy, they were really involved. Dr. Edwin Stevens is one I particularly remember, and I think there's a Stevens Way too. But he was a very social, concerned person, and during his most vibrant years in this church, he would have forums almost every Sunday after church on some social or political concern, and just committed his life and his involvement in the church to seeing that these well-known names and strong leadership were brought to the congregation. And even Hiram Chittenden of the Locks was a member of this church at one time. So we've been around a while. It isn't just a new thing, and it's kind of an interesting history. One of the things that intrigues me is that from 1904 to 1984, there were just 4 ministers. In other words, there were these long-term commitments to the church. One was for 24 years, my dad was here for 20 years, and Dale Turner was here for 24 years. So it's not been a come and go kind of leadership. It's been a continuous, stable, growing sort of leadership. So in 1937, which I was telling, my story begins, and we were living in Wisconsin, and my dad, who had grown up in Oregon, always led us to believe that life would be fine once we got back to the Pacific Northwest again. Meanwhile, we were just marking time for that there. So when the Seattle University Congregational Church telephoned and asked him to come out for a visit and candidate, and he was just delighted. And he did it, and we were all just waiting because we were ready to go. We'd been in this little town of Wisconsin for 10 years, and life seemed a little bit tight, so it was fun to get out and think about the new place. So one of the things that has stuck in my mind always is when he came home, he already had this vision of a different location of the church. He said, that church has got to move. This is a university, student-serving church. And here we are over on 43rd and Brooklyn. We've got to get up there near the campus. And when he came, he started right out with that, what they then called the Board of Trustees, which is now the Church Council, I guess, or something like that. But they all agreed and were very excited about it, and started immediately looking at locations, and along 16th, where we are now, there were old houses, kind of like the Gold House across the alley from us, and one or another would be for sale, and the church would just buy it, and across the street where we have parking lots, the church would buy the property, so that by the time the vision had been sold, shall we say, to the congregation, they were very excited about the whole prospect. Then World War II came along, and that slowed them down because you just couldn't do that kind of building at that time. So it was put on hold as far as the actual construction goes, but it was certainly not on hold as far as the intention of the church to make this move. And so late 1940s, I guess they started building. And in 1952, the current building we are now in was dedicated. It was the right thing to do. Okay, so the new church was built, and there was a very strong commitment to college students at that time, and there has been for a long time, which has kind of been put on the back burner for a while, and many of us hope that isn't there permanently. But I don't know if you're familiar with Pilgrim Room, which is down at the end of the hall here, was the college student room. It had its outside door, it had its own kitchen, college kids were welcome to come in there, and it was a very central gathering place for the college-age kids. My dad wanted his office to be where he could see these students, so where the library is now, the offices of the church were, and his was there, and he told me what a joy it was to just sit at his desk and look out the window and see these students walking back and forth. So he had a very strong commitment to the university students as such. Now, one of the things that I have been asked time and time again by people who know I've been around a while, is this church always so social action, social conscience oriented? And I can, without blinking an eye, say yes. And I have just a few examples that I like to share. I've done this in every meeting, so some of you have heard this before, but they're pretty touching. One of them that particularly means a lot to me was during World War II, on the communion table, they had a wooden frame that held small flags, and all the flags of the Allies were there. Now, we don't think of flags as being very theological or religious now, but you've got to remember that during that time, many, many of the young men from our church were over in Europe or in the Orient in World War II, and my young brother was one of them in that. So it was a way of supporting the troops. But the Sunday after the armistice was signed, the French, the German, and the Japanese flag were added to this display. And this made national news. Dave, my husband who comes from New England, his folks saw a picture of it in the Boston Globe. It was really a huge move to react so quickly to engage in the unifying of what had been this painful conflict for so many years. So that speaks, I think, for social action and liberalism. Certainly our church at that point gave a strong support to COs, conscientious objectors, we call them. And another thing that we wrestled with difficulty with was the evacuation of the Japanese people during the World War II. Awful, awful thing to have done. And for some months, many of them were nearby, and our church would send meals down or people to go down and just say, we're thinking of you, we miss you, that sort of thing, just to keep in touch. So the outreach, again, for something that was not very liberal to have done in terms of the government, but very liberal in terms of a church who said, forget that, we care about these people, they're important to us. And one other thing that I made note of here is that shortly after World War II, there was a family in the church who had a large home up on Capitol Hill that they, instead of selling, gave to the church with the commitment from the church that it would be a home for homeless youth. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Homeless youth, we still do it. But back then, this home was established, and it was called the Griffin Home. And I just learned not too long ago that there is this agency still is operating down in the Renton area called Griffin Home, Griffin Home for Boys. Is that what it is? Okay, well that started with this church in probably the early 50s or late 40s. So those are the years that I was mostly involved in the church, or where my dad was. And then he retired in 1957, and in 1958, the well-known and much-loved Dale Turner was called to the church. I wish Greg, his son, were here to tell you more about it. I was not living here at that time. And he was here then until 1982.